Okay, continuing on with these, I'm going to be talking about chapter 3 and chapter 4 of psychological types. Chapter 3, Jung is going through Nietzsche's concept of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And then in chapter 4, Jung is going through Hall. No, not Hall. Is it Hall? Jordan. Someone named Jordan. Jordan's psychological types. It seems like at this point Jung is just kind of going through the antecedents to his theories and critiquing them a little bit. In the case of Nietzsche's idea of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, it's not necessarily that he's critiquing Nietzsche's concepts. He's just adding that they don't map directly onto extroversion and introversion because Nietzsche also, through his own, INTJ kind of psychology, associates introversion more with intuition and extroversion more with what Jung calls sensation feeling, just this kind of undifferentiated view of sensation and feeling. It's kind of just affectivity, he calls it. And so he gets into an interesting little throwaway sentence there. He has a lot of quote unquote throwaway sentences that are actually quite deep in this book. This one is that he's talking about how intuition and sensation are more primitive relative to thinking and feeling, which strikes me as definitely very true. Like, whenever I feel like morally judged, it usually is when I'm like talking with a thinking or a feeling type, dominant thinking or feeling type. It's like I'll make an observation and an intuitive or sensing dominant type is just like, okay, yeah. Whereas like a thinking or feeling dominant type will be like, why would you say that? So the idea of purposes is, I think, more inherent to the rational functions, which is interesting. It also like produced this image in me of like how people talk about like, oh, this is very civilized what we're doing. We're having like coffee and we're going snowboarding. Like, that was kind of the image of feeling that arose for me, where it was almost detached from like really strong emotions, which is helpful for thinking about how feeling is not just emotions. Like, everybody talks about how the feeling function is not just emotions, but then like it stops there and we don't really discriminate past that. But it's almost like that there are these cultivated categories of feeling that can like not actually have that much to do with violent emotion that Jung seems to be pointing towards, like the idea of like loving your nation, that can obviously devolve into violent kind of nationalism, but in the feeling world, it also has this image of just France personified as this woman or whatever. So that all was very interesting. He makes some comments in the Jordan chapter about, and in the Nietzsche chapter too, about intuition being essentially this like being this energizing principle that brings unconscious contents into consciousness, And I don't know how much we actually end up saying when we explain the intuitive function this way. I think the unconscious just kind of ends up as this empty signifier that we just kind of say, oh, that's what intuition is pulling from. Because if I were to explain intuition in, maybe a more ancient way, where I'm just talking about like this inner eye that just perceives ideas outside of itself, and it's sort of like this sense organ that's akin to your eyes or whatever. I don't think we end up saying any more or less than Jung's idea of intuition related to the unconscious. It's like in both views, there's this window of consciousness, and something appears in that window, and whether it's kind of this other realm of phantasms, or it's this kind of interior realm of the unconscious, I don't see really how one explains the other better, other than it being kind of a metaphysical prejudice. So yeah, that was my kind of reaction to intuition being so closely associated with the unconscious. There was another thing about intuition that I wanted to say. Oh, kind of the primitive aspect of it was, I think that's important for thinking about intuition, because it's really like this thing that you can't help but see when you're talking about intuition. If we're talking about like this forced association where like I have the idea of Regina Spektor and like denim jeans, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to find some link between these two. Like, oh, the Soviet Union, like, it's kind of like, okay, you decided before the fact that you were going to look for a connection, and so, the Soviet Union was one of an indefinite amount that you could have. Whereas if you talk about like it just forcing itself upon you, it makes intuition seem more like a sense organ rather than a deliberation, which I think is what we want to capture here. And then one last thing is that Jung has like twice now basically just used the idea, the orientation towards the idea, as his definition of introversion. He does it again in the chapter 3, which I love. Like I think that's essentially right. I think it can be easy to see how the idea falls into the realm of thinking, when the idea is acting as this class that acts down upon the object and excludes and includes certain things. I think that can be problematic. I think it's easy to associate thinking with introversion there. But if we think about the idea as being more than that, like I feel like the soul, like the idea as soul, is a good way of thinking about how feeling relates to the introverted aspect of something. So yeah, I think there are a couple of places where my interpretation is right in line with what Jung wants to do, and I think it's even kind of easier for him sometimes to talk about the idea being the thing that's important rather than the subject. So yeah, those are my thoughts on chapter 3 and 4.